This presentation will cover the next steps in your building research. First, we'll take a look at developing historic contexts, and then we'll use that to determine the significance of the historic building. Once you've nailed the physical description, your next step is to do some more research and explore the historic context of your site. Places and events in history do not develop in a vacuum. They absorb and reflect broader patterns. Historic contexts go beyond a brief summary of historic events. They are not necessarily long, but they should be thorough in consideration of these three dimensions: time, space, and theme. They must include enough detail to later show how broad themes connect with specific elements in the property's history. Historic preservation is a practice of trying to ensure that disparate communities understand and recognize each other's stories, especially those that are connected to a sense of place. There are many reasons to provide a thorough context in your evaluation, but this might be the big one. Your context is a brief collection of stories that apply to your property. To evaluate a property, you should not set out to write a book about all of the threads of history that may have interacted with your site. Just explore, collect, explain, and move forward. Write about the major themes associated with your site so that you can move on to determining significance, integrity, and eligibility for the National Register. A strong historic context will pull in information about patterns and events that were important during the relevant period in history. The time period, or period of significance, for any given property is generally based on the earliest and latest occurrence of an important event, activity, or date of development or construction. Period of significance derives from a property's history, not its physical appearance. Please follow guidance from the National Register of Historic Places to further define and apply this concept. The period of significance guides your research and analysis in the historic context. It provides a temporal boundary that narrows the focus of your research. When you begin drafting a context, make a guess about the property's period of significance. Explore events and histories related to that time and place, even if you aren't yet sure that they impact that specific property. For instance, if you're looking at a property that was constructed in the 1950s, refresh your knowledge of that decade. Reach for secondary sources that address the regional or national context, such as history of mid-century architecture or the mid-century chapter of a book about Forest Service history. As a general rule, you shouldn't write a regional or national context from primary sources in an evaluation. Instead, this is an excellent occasion for paraphrasing larger reports and building a robust collection of works cited. To understand the local context, you might have to be able to rely on local histories, but you also might need to retrieve some primary materials. It is appropriate to revise the period of significance in the final draft of your historic context. This reflects your new knowledge of the property and its history. Once established, the period of significance helps you evaluate integrity. If you decide that the property is historic, the period of significance is crucial in your assessment of undertakings and effects, but we'll dig into that in the next lesson. A strong historic context covers at least one broad historical theme to define the associations that might make a property significant. Thematic associations are generally based on how and why people develop and used the property throughout its history. The National Register provides a set of 8 historical themes to get you started. Those themes are: 1. Peopling places, 2. Creating social institutions and movements, 3. Expressing cultural values, 4. Shaping the political landscape, 5. Developing the American economy, 6. Expanding science and technology. 7. Transforming the environment. And 8. Changing the role of the United States in the world community. The National Register also provides a set of areas of significance. This addresses pertinent environmental, economic, cultural, technological, settlement, and governmental factors related to themes. There's no need to explicitly name themes and areas of significance in your context. Save that for the statement of significance that follows. For now, let themes inform your approach or guide your research. Please reference National Register publications for more specific information about each theme and area of significance. If you are researching a common or utilitarian property on the national forests, most of these themes and areas of significance could apply. Consider why the property was developed in the first place, how it changed, and whether it had an impact on its community. This helps you flesh out an analysis under Criterion A of the National Register. For example, your study of an old dew ranch might merit a brief historical exploration of settlement patterns, economics and technology related to ranching, government-issued grazing permits, recreation and tourism, etc. Consider the property type and whether it is important in illustrating the historic context. This helps you flesh out an analysis under Criterion C of the National Register. For example, your study of that ranch might also merit an exploration of log barn construction or lodging quarters for hired hands and guests. Once you've identified the context, it's time to connect these ideas back to the property types and the National Register framework for defining historic significance. Write a statement of significance that defines the way that your property might reflect its history. This will provide the framework for establishing whether the historic building you are researching is eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. Define significance in 3 steps. 1. Apply the National Register criteria. 2. Apply the areas of significance. And 3. Apply the period of significance. This is another occasion when you should be able to rely on secondary sources. The Forest Service has a rich collection of publications that include evaluation guides. These will help you write an accurate and authoritative statement of significance. Unfortunately, these evaluation guides aren't all in one place. We recommend that you reach out to your colleagues to locate secondary sources. You could also reach out to your SHPO to see if they have evaluation guides or sample evaluations that relate to the property you are evaluating. If you really don't have an evaluation guide applicable to the property that you need to evaluate, then seek out another determination of eligibility that may apply. If you really feel that your property has no precedence in other evaluations and secondary sources, then draft a short statement of significance from scratch. Consult with a colleague at the Forest Service or at the SHPO. It's likely that your property lacks integrity, and that makes it harder to verify the potential for significance. For instance, if you're studying a recreation residence tract that was developed in the 1950s, your historic context would explore the history of recreation development on that forest, the broader recreation residence movement throughout the agency, and the architectural influence that were popular during that era. Now, in your statement of significance, define how intact recreation residences can be historically significant. If they have integrity, recreation residences meet Criterion A for their association with the influential recreation residence program. They meet Criterion C because they are often designed as formal neighborhoods and they reflect an established set of architectural qualities or characteristics. They are likely to have significance in the areas of architecture, community planning and development, conservation, landscape architecture, social history, and/or recreation. Their period of significance is typically 1915 through 1960, but you would refine that period to the specific tract. In our rec residence example, you would look for descriptions of other historic recreational residences. You would also look for evaluation guides that address mid-century housing styles and construction methods. When you're done writing the statement of significance, you should now have a few paragraphs that provide a framework for evaluating your specific property. Next, we move on to evaluate integrity. This is the point at which we determine if the Jenga tower will stand. We have described the property's physical appearance and identified its specific history within a broader context. Now, we determine if the layers all fit together. Complete your statement of significance by applying the framework to the property in question. Does it meet the National Register criteria under the specific terms that you have refined? Does its current appearance match the way it looked during the period of significance that you have defined? In one concise sentence, state that property is or is not eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. In 1 or 2 paragraphs, explain that conclusion. Draw on evidence from your physical description and historic context. If you struggle to make a determination one way or the other, remember that the first part of your analysis have provided a useful foundation of evidence. Your conclusion should draw on that evidence. Furthermore, as the person who led this research and visited this site in person, you are a subject matter expert in a certain sense. In this conclusion, trust your knowledge of the property and write a strong statement to communicate what you really think. The key is to provide a coherent analysis that your colleagues can respond to. If a reviewer within the Forest Service or the SHPO can read your conclusion and understand how it connects to the history and physical state of the property, then it has served its purpose. They may concur or dispute your conclusion, but the analysis has served its initial purpose. By the way, there are a number of places that are generally not considered to be significant. It's useful to know that there are outliers. However, if your property is one of these outliers, you are still welcome to make an argument in support of its significance. These include birthplaces, cemeteries and graveyards, religious properties, relocated or reconstructed buildings, commemorative properties, and properties that are less than 50 years old. There are always exceptions. For example, a religious property may derive its primary significance from architectural or artistic distinction or historical importance. A reconstructed building could be significant if it is an accurate reconstruction used primarily for interpretation. You might never evaluate a property that falls precisely into one of these categories, but the underlying message is that you can make the argument if you think a property is significant. You are more likely to evaluate properties that reflect multiple phases or eras of development. For example, some Forest Service administrative compounds are remarkably intact from their initial period of development, while others may show layers from different historical periods. Some Forest Service compounds were built by the Conservation Corps in the 1930s, then filled in with temporary housing units and other facilities after World War II. It's interesting to consider that these sites are not aesthetically cohesive, but they still reflect a remarkable facet of the agency's history. Again, you can draw on your first-hand knowledge of the site and your exploration of the historic context to make a recommendation. This concludes the final word on evaluations and determinations of eligibility. In the next section, we will consider integrity, undertakings and effects, and the Secretary of the Interior's standards for the treatment of historic properties.